Well, today is a special day for our fellowship. If it wasn't for lockdown, it's a day that would have come much, much sooner. But we're still really, really thankful that this evening, one of our precious covenant children is being baptised. And this evening, we're going to all have the opportunity to promise that we are going to pray for Daniel, one of our covenant children. But that's tonight. This is this morning. I spent a large part of the start of this week thinking to myself, what passage do I want to preach on for Daniel's baptism? And I thought about several different passages, but the one that really struck in my mind was Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verses 6 and 7. And I'm sure that as we read through that, maybe at the start of the passage you were thinking, well, what's this got to do with baptism? Why has Jonny picked this? I would imagine, though, after you reached verse 6 and verse 7, you realised exactly why I picked that passage. Great, helpful, practical instruction for parents in how to bring up their children. Exactly what William and Stephanie need to hear. Exactly what I need to hear and Ruth needs to hear and every parent here needs to hear. And yet, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I don't want you to think that this passage is just about parents and not about anybody else, because not everybody here is in that place. This passage, far from being just about parents, it's for all of us, because it shows us exactly what we need to hear. It tells us something about the wonder and the graciousness of the God we serve. And so let me tell you what we're going to do. Tonight, we're going to zoom in on verses 6 and 7, and a few other verses as well. We're going to see how challenging and how helpful they are for parents. But this morning what we're going to do is we're going to try and look at the big picture of the whole chapter. And we're going to see how it challenges us and it encourages us, all of us, no matter what stage of life we're at. So let's come and see what is going on. Now, I realise Deuteronomy is not maybe a book that all of us are terribly familiar with. But basically, if you've never read Deuteronomy before, the best way of thinking about it is it's one big sermon. Or maybe it's several smaller sermons, but one big sermon. And the preacher in Deuteronomy is Moses. And he has got a direct message from God for the people of Israel. And it's really helpful to realise this is happening at a really pivotal moment in the history of that people. 40 years before this, the people of Israel were being abused by the Egyptians. They were slaves. They were on the brink of being exterminated. And yet, if you've read the book of Exodus, you'll know what happened next. We actually read about it in Psalm 136 as well. God stepped in. God performed incredible miracles. He sent these plagues against these Egyptians who had abused his people so badly. And whenever it looked like there was no hope whatsoever, God turned it around. You maybe remember the story of the Red Sea. Israel had their backs against the wall. It looked like they were about to be annihilated, and God tore that sea open. They marched through on dry ground, and then what did God do? He brought the waves crashing back down, and he wiped out the Egyptians who were trying to kill them. And then, what did God do after that? Well, his people walked through the desert, and God upheld them. He sent them food every single day, so they were able to survive. He gave them water. He showed them incredible grace. And yet, what happened next? In spite of everything that God had done for these people, they rebelled. They grumbled. They said, we don't want to follow you. We want to go back to what we were before. And so, because of that, God, rather than taking them straight into the promised land, God caused these people to wander in the desert for 40 years. Well, as you can see from chapter 1 and verse 3 of Deuteronomy, those 40 years are now up. They're past. That generation that had rebelled against God in spite of everything he'd done for them, that generation is gone. They've died out. And the next generation has grown up. And this new generation, they are at this really, really pivotal moment because they are finished with walking in the desert. Now, as you can see in verse 1, they're standing by the Jordan. And the Jordan was a river, and it was like the boundary between the promised land and the land outside. These people are standing on the very threshold of what God has promised them. All they have to do is walk a little bit more, and their feet will be standing on the very ground that God has promised. It's a really pivotal moment. Now, I realise that sounds like good news, and it is good news. It is. But God knew, and Moses knew as he preached this sermon, that there was really dangerous ground, really dangerous road ahead. Moses knew that the people who lived in this land were desperately wicked. And so once the Israelites get settled down, once they sort of settle into the land, what is to say that they will not go down exactly the same path as the people currently living in the promised land? What is to say that the Israelites will not get sucked in by the same idols and the same rituals and the same lusts? What is to say that the people of Israel will not end up wallowing in exactly the same mire as these desperately wicked Canaanites? That's the big question of the book of Deuteronomy. That is what's at the heart of the story. And we see that, for example, in verse 12 and verse 14 of this chapter. God knows there is something really, really seductive about the way these Canaanites live. And so through Moses, he warns his people against the danger of getting sucked in. I think for us to understand this passage, it's going to be very relevant tonight, we need to try and put ourselves into the shoes of the Israelites, and we need to try and understand at least something of how seductive this would have actually been. For example, let's think about maybe the most famous of the Canaanite gods. That was Baal, someone we read about quite often in the Old Testament. We've got children here. I'll not go into the gory details. Even if we didn't have children, I maybe wouldn't go into all the gory details. Let's just say a service for Baal would not have been like one of our services today. It would have been rated 18 at the very least. Temple of Baal would have been a perfect place to pick up certain diseases. Let's just say it was a travesty. It was depraved. It was sensual. But let's be honest, in a rather perverse way, it would have been very pleasurable as well. And it's easy to imagine young, hormonal, Jewish teenage boys being very, very intrigued by what went on in Baal's services. And then, not only that, but there's the way in which these false gods, they preyed on people's emotions and they preyed on people's vulnerabilities. Some of you maybe remember the old iPhone ad from about 10 years ago now. There's an app for that. A few of you, not too many. Well, the Canaanite gods, they were a bit like that. There's a god for that, no matter what your problem is. Let's say there's a drought and you've planted your crops and you desperately need rain for your crops so they don't wither. Well, there's a god of rain, and that god can get you out of your hole. Let's say you and your wife, you've been trying to have children, but you haven't been able to conceive. Well, there's a god of fertility, and she can help you out. And it doesn't matter what you want. There is a God for everything. A God who can help you to get exactly what you want. And so you can imagine the pressure that people were under. And then bear in mind, all of these gods, they're far less hassle than the God of Israel. I mean, I don't mean this, but the God of Israel was far more high maintenance, if you want to think of it that way, than these gods. He's always demanding, isn't he? always telling us how we should live, always expecting people to do as he says. But these gods, they're not like that at all. None of them expect absolute allegiance. They're more than happy for you to take them out of the cupboard whenever you need them and put them straight back whenever you're done. They couldn't care less how you live in between. They're more than happy for you to live the way you want. And there's something really appealing about that, isn't there? A God that promises to tick all the boxes, and he doesn't really expect anything from you in return. It's attractive. And yet, it's the path of absolute disaster, isn't it? Because a God like that can never, ever deliver. I think one of the lessons for us in the book of Deuteronomy is that we need to be extremely wary of those sorts of gods. Now, I know what you're maybe thinking. You're maybe thinking this is all very primitive. There's no temple to Baal in Letterkenny. There are no followers of Asherah or Dagon in Donegal. That's true, as far as I know. But we all have our own idols, don't we? And our idols in 2020, they're maybe a lot more subtle and a lot more sophisticated than these false gods. The idol of popularity, the idol of sport, the idol of your social media image, the idol of work, the idol of being in a relationship, the idol of money or cars or career or sex or entertainment or lifestyle or whatever. You know, even something really wholesome, something like getting married or raising a family in the right way, that can so easily become an idol. Something that captures the affections of our heart, something that we obsess over and we pin all of our hopes on and all of our joys on it, and God gets pushed out. And God says to us here, be wary. And maybe here in Donegal, there's an idol that is even more subtle again. It's the idol of God himself. How many people in Donegal pledge allegiance to the God of the Bible, but he's not really the God of the Bible? I mean, yes, he does miracles. Yes, he sent Jesus into the world. Yes, he's the God of all of these stories in the Bible here. But in reality, he's far more like the false gods that Moses warns us about. He doesn't need absolute commitment. He's happy enough if you take him out of the cupboard whenever you need him, and then you put him back whenever it's inconvenient. If you do something to wrong him, well, he's happy enough that you can mollify him with maybe a little bit of extra devotion, and then everything's going to be okay again. He's a God who ticks whatever boxes you need, and then he gets out of the way. And it's tragic, isn't it? There are so many people, and they think they're following the true God. They think that that's who they've pledged their allegiance to, but they haven't. He's far more like the idols that Moses is warning us about in this chapter. It's tragic, because these Canaanites show us if you put anything in God's place, whether it's a thing or an idea or a person or your version of what you think God is like, it always leads to misery and disaster. These gods always let us down. Always. They always lead to wasted lives. They always lead to despair. And worst of all, the one who created the universe, the one who sent his son to die on the cross, he's robbed of the glory that belongs to him. So surely Moses' warning is just as relevant for us. we need to watch out for idols. Here's the thing. Once you have started down the path of following idols, it's impossible to remove them from your heart. You can't remove them because they'll always come back. They'll always fill up the empty space, and if it's not that idol, it's going to be another idol. And so if you are going to get out of the grip of idols, you can't just remove them, you have to replace them. And that's what brings us to verse 4. Verse 4, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Now, for Jews, this may well have been the most famous verse in the entire Old Testament. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. If you were to ask a Jew to recite the Shema, this is the verse that they will recite. Shema, it's just the Hebrew word for hear. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And I want to say a few things about this verse. I mean, literally, you could have a whole sermon series on this verse, but we're not going to do that. But the first thing I want to mention is the word Lord. And I know I've said this before, but it's really important. When you see the word Lord in capital letters, it's not a title, it's a name. When you see the word Lord in capital letters, the writer in the Hebrew has used God's special name, the name that he revealed to Moses at the burning bush. Remember, I am, or Yahweh, or Jehovah. Now, we'll not go into the history of why our translations today write the word Lord, but when you see it in capital letters, it's God's special name. It's Yahweh. And that name was really, really precious. It was really important to God's people because it reminded them of what he had done through Moses in Egypt, and it reminded them that God was a covenant God. Not a God who's away up there, not a God who's in his ivory tower and doesn't care about what's going on down here, but a God who has entered into a covenant relationship with his people. A God who leads his people, protects his people, and blesses his people. And I know that we can take it for granted so easily, but is it not absolutely amazing? Hear, O Israel, the Lord, or Yahweh, our God. He's a personal God who binds himself to us. Second thing to say is the Lord is one. Doesn't sound terribly groundbreaking to us, but it would have been revolutionary in those days. These Canaanites, they had so many different types of gods. There's a God for that. And I mean, I'm sure that many of you'll end up having maybe some Christmas party food this week. There'll be some sausage rolls and some cocktail sausages, and maybe if you're a little bit posh, you'll have some vol au vents or salmon canapes or something like that, whatever posh people eat. But whenever you have food like that, what do? You pick whatever you want. If there's something you fancy, you put it on your plate. If there's something you really like, you take twice as much. And if there's something you're just not really into, well then, you don't have to worry. And that's just like these false gods. You can have a bit of this god, a bit of that god, and if that god over there, that's not really your thing, it's no big deal. But how different is Yahweh, the God of Israel? The Lord is one, not one of many, but one and only one. You can't even begin to compare this God to these charlatans that the pagan people are worshipping. He's the only God, the only one who is worthy of worship, the only one who is able to save, the only one who's able to give joy, the only one who is able to keep and to satisfy. This is the God in verse 3 who blesses his people beyond their wildest expectations. He's the one in verse 10 who keeps the promises he made from years and years before. He's the one in verse 11 who gives his people grace beyond what they deserve. He's the one in verse 12 who has rescued them from misery. This is the God who doesn't just tell us, listen, you're not supposed to worship idols. He does more than that. He makes those idols completely unnecessary in the first place. Because whenever we see what this God of glory is really truly like, well, our hearts are full, aren't they? And there's no room left for those idols that let us down. Now, tonight, we're going to see what all of this means for William and Stephanie and Daniel and any parents and children in the congregation. But for now, let me just say what it means for all of us. For Christians, God warns you in this passage not to get complacent. Notice verse 12. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And for the Jewish people, being brought out of Egypt was the crowning moment of God's salvation. It was the one dramatic moment where God decisively and definitively stepped into history and set them free. It was a great moment. But for us, there's a better moment, isn't there? Because the most decisive moment of all of God's salvation, it's not the rescue from Egypt, it's something that happened later. It's Jesus stepping into this world and being crucified in our place. And so God is saying to us through this passage, don't forget what I did in Egypt, but even more importantly, don't forget the cross. Keep it in your mind's eye. Keep on thinking about it. Keep on talking about it. Keep on reading about it. Keep on thanking God for what he's done through Jesus Christ. That is how you stop your heart getting captured by an idol. But there's also an application for anybody who hasn't yet experienced this salvation. And I wonder, if you were to examine your own heart, can you maybe see some idols of your own? Maybe it's work. You lose yourself in your work. You work and you work and you work because it gives you value or it gives you an escape. But if you're perfectly honest, it doesn't actually make you happy. And even if it does, eventually the time's going to come when you can work no more. What about social media validation? Maybe for the younger ones especially. Not just the young ones, of course. Every time you put a picture on Instagram that you've carefully curated, you're anxiously checking to see how many likes you get. And if you don't get enough likes, then you're crushed. And if you do get enough likes, then you have that high, but it doesn't last for long. You have to do it all again. Maybe your idol is a relationship. You've pinned all your hopes on having a husband or a wife, but now that you're married, you're finding that marriage is not the fairy tale you thought it was going to be. We need to see this morning these idols, whatever they may be, no matter how wholesome they may be, they're always going to crush us because we have been made for something more. And so this morning, if you have not yet put your trust in Jesus Christ, let me urge you to do that. Let me urge you, don't settle for imitations. You need to have the real thing. And I promise you, when you have this gracious, covenant-keeping Saviour for yourself, each and every one of these idols will lose its pull. May each and every one of us remember the God who brought his people out of Egypt, and even more importantly, brought us out of slavery through Jesus Christ's work on the cross. Well, if you're able, please stand as we pray.